Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I get the fun job of helping you sort of think macro for a few minutes. Let's think about the world, where geopolitical cycles are going, what it means for technology, what technology means for those geopolitical cycles. We'll go big picture, and then we'll take it down to what it really means for all of us operating in the fintech space. So I'm from Eurasia Group. We're the world's largest geopolitical risk analysis firm. We've got a team that looks just at geotechnology, the intersection of geopolitics and technology. And we actually develop and deploy all sorts of methods to try and predict politics using the latest innovative technologies. I'd be happy to talk to you about any of that after this. But today, let's dive in. So we're at a geopolitical inflection point, right? It's very clear something is not right in the global political commons. You look around, you see a global community that's fractured, no global police man, woman, no global police force. You see a world without leadership. And you're in what we would call a geopolitical recession, right? An economic recession, you're thinking about the absence of growth, right? In a geopolitical recession, you're thinking about the absence of stability. And you're seeing an absence of stability at a global level, you're seeing it at a country level. This is a long cycle and it's an ugly one. And it's happening at a moment that the world is accelerating, right? It's happening at a moment when governments are least prepared to deal with technologies that are moving faster than they could ever fathom, moving faster than they could possibly regulate, let alone understand. Now, why is that happening? Those are some sweeping statements, right? Well, there's one big explanation for it. This man, right? So the U.S. Was probably in retreat regardless, right? If Hillary Clinton had been president, you would have seen a U.S. that was doing less around the world. You would have seen U.S. standing declining, a set of rising powers. Trump is dead set on doing that as fast as possible, right? So you've got a president running around breaking up international treaties, retreating from global accords, starting trade wars, regulating, using national security to look at technology transactions cross-border, like Broadcom, Qualcomm, basically say, no, thanks, we don't want it. Even question whether the US wants to give visas to the next generation of coders and innovators to come to the country. It's all happening right before our eyes. We see it happening, right? One big factor. Second factor, you've got China on the rise. And guess what? You've got a leader of China that's going nowhere, right? Xi Jinping just told us a few things this year. Number one, China is going to be a global power, not just a regional power. Number two, he's not going anywhere. Number three, they're going to be a leader in artificial intelligence technology, and they can point the entire state at developing that, right? Rather than in the West, where our companies try and do this, actually have a tenuous relationship with the government. The Chinese government, what's destined to be the world's largest economy, is going to focus like a laser on developing that technology as fast as possible and deploying it. And by the way, it's going to use that to reinforce its stability. So he's not going anywhere. That regime's not going anywhere. And by the way, neither is this guy, right? So Mr. Putin just won re-election. I guess we nailed that forecast. Any of you in the forecasting business probably did as well. He knows a lot about technology too. He's not afraid to use it, and he's not going anywhere either. Meanwhile, in Europe, everything on the board ends with a question mark, right? So you've got the US in retreat, you've got China on the rise, you've got Russia as a spoiler, and you've just got a whole bunch of questions about where Europe's going. Is the UK in or out? Can Merkel actually govern? In Italy, are they actually going to be governed by a clown, right? This was a possibility with the Five-Star Movement. Is Europe too mired in its own questions to be at the forefront? If you think about that, that's a big subsection of kind of global power and global dominance. That's the geopolitical backdrop against which we're all operating. So what does it mean? Right, well, I'll give you 3 W's if you only remember one thing to think about, right? We've got wealth, warfare, warfare. These are kind of the 3 elements that I think about when I'm thinking through how this political backdrop is going to play out as technology races ahead, right? It's going to leave a lot of people displaced, and it's going to create political cycles that require resolution, right? So clearly, right, this whole summit today is about the wealth and the power of deploying new technologies to enhance it, to create efficiency in the markets, deploy new tools, to bank the unbanked, to kind of create alternatives and lead growth for the next generation. And that's going to have huge economic uplift and benefit across a number of countries, right? We can think about countries that are already deploying it, like Kenya, places where some of this new technology is actually going to be implemented to raise tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So you've got the wealth side of it. We can never forget that. On the flip side, a lot of people are going to be left behind. You already have a backdrop before technology of international disparities, right? I mean, what was Trump's election about? What was Brexit about? What are some of these votes about in the democratic countries that are effectively saying, you know, we're not really interested in what the establishment has on offer. We want something else because we're losing. Well, guess what? With new technologies that even if you were proficient in them today, you're not going to be proficient in next year, 5 years, or 10 years from now, it leaves a lot of people behind. It's raised all sorts of calls for universal basic income. It's almost heartwarming to say, yes, that's a good idea, right? We should just pay off all the people who lose. But guess what? We've got a lot of examples of what that does. I mean, look at all the oil states around the world. If you just start distributing money to people to not work because you have wealth, what ends up happening, you effectively end up buying their political rights. And that's not a great alternative to the sort of democratic capitalist systems in the West. I think we need to be cautious when we think about UBI and instead think about reinvesting for upskilling and bringing the next generation ahead of us, or else you're going to wind up 10, 20, 30 years down the road as you are with some of these oil economies, looking and saying, how do you get into how do you actually build a dynamic economy from here? You have to do it at the same time. It's not either or, but if you basically make people wards of the state, then they're dependent on the state and they pledge their allegiance to the state. It's bad from a political science point of view. Finally, you've got this warfare element. You're seeing it on the economic side, right? You're seeing it, I mentioned the Broadcom-Qualcomm deal. You can think about the trade war Trump is picking with China, how the Chinese are going to respond. It's very clear tech is going to get embroiled in this. In fact, so much so, you can think about a sort of US-China tech Cold War. Right? This is a concept we put out this year in our top 10 risks, that actually this is kind of the tipping point where China's told us they're going to be a global power, they're going to win at AI, that we have to start thinking about how right now the US and China are in a race and they're neck and neck, and you know, maybe they get 6 or 12 or 18 months ahead of the other before the other country catches up in terms of deployment of AI, but at some point there is the possibility that one of these countries will break ahead, and when they do, it has pretty dramatic implications if you're thinking in the world of cyber, if you're thinking in the world of traditional warfare. What if quantum computing leads one country to be able to unencrypt all of the other countries' encrypted information? Does that give them a dominant advantage when they have access to all of that? That's a question we'll be worried about in a couple of years. What happens when one country actually deploys autonomous weapons, right? Smart weapons. What happens in an environment where the UN, you know, sort of claims that it has an interest in regulating these things, but can barely foster a dialogue about it? It's every nation for themselves. And in every nation for themselves, you build up the technology like in a Cold War mentality, and you deploy it later. It's leading to fragmentation as a result, right? You've got two different poles. You've got a US version of the global tech commons and a Chinese version of it. There may be a third, there may be a Russian internet, and a different version of that as well. That fragmentation is pretty damning from a doing business perspective, right? Who do you trust? Who do you do business with? What's a single set of protocols? Who do you build your tools and your technology for if you're not sure who's going to win? So you have this fragmentation of the tech commons, and third countries are really getting pulled in the middle, right? Countries where the tension between the US and China is raw get stuck in the middle. A lot of talk about digital currencies on the last panel. This year, things start to get real, right? For every Bitcoin millionaire, there's a few $100,000 of tax that's due to the governments that up until now have not tried to de-anonymize where all that money went. I suspect you're going to see the IRS and a number of different governments try and figure out who's made all these transactions. We'll see just how anonymous a lot of these technologies really are once governments start to actively try and follow the money. We've seen exchanges get the boot. We've seen governments not want to subsidize mining because of its electricity demands. And it's not just criminals that are using digital currency and good guys, right? It's not good guys and traditional criminals. It's actually states that want to deploy digital currencies to get around international law. So you're seeing Venezuela deploy it to get around sanctions with the petrodollar. You're seeing potentially Russia with the petroruble do it. If you can control your own currency, the US can't shut you off from access to the dollar and access to finance. So it's an interesting set of intersections there. For the developing world, this isn't great news, right? The traditional development models of industrialize, develop a service economy, eventually move to a knowledge economy don't work when we don't industrialize anymore because we can 3D print whatever we want at home, when services are actually driven by artificial intelligence. We're looking for cities to be the shining light in a lot of these places, not nation states. A lot of folks will get left behind. And resiliency through human capital, state capacity, and demographics is potentially the only way forward. So let me leave you with a few big takeaways, and then I'm happy to stick around if anyone wants to continue the conversation. The winners are countries that capture gains from technology and innovation. So where are we developing this technology? Who can deploy it? Even some of the large emerging market countries like China and India that are able to direct their state to build tech sectors do just fine, despite having tremendous populations, right? The third bullet here, thinking differently about demographics is pretty important. We used to think about a demographic dividend, so a big population like China or India would be a good thing, or Nigeria, not if you're not able to leverage it into new technology. So a declining population like Japan actually looks better than a place like Nigeria, where traditional economic models wouldn't tell you that. We're no longer worried about a country like Japan as we were in the past. The other winners are those that are able to leapfrog in development and deployment of mobile technology and digital, like Kenya. We've seen some great stories there. And finally, there's this big question I'll leave you with, which is what role are companies going to play in shaping all of the answers to the questions that I've put forward? You see a lot of the leaders in the tech space decide to take stands on ethics, to take stands on innovation policy, but they're going to need to take bigger stands on what the structure of the entire ecosystem and government that they're operating in should look like going forward. It's not enough to just talk about tech, because that's going to determine who wins the future. So thank you very much for your time today.